much for being with us. Colin is a mechanic, and if that's an understatement, I don't know what it is, because Colin has had an extraordinary career that started off as a motor mechanic in the 1950s and went through to being one of the acknowledged great engine builders and testers and racing mechanics in Australia, and ended up a teacher. So it's been an interesting progression through the years for Colin Russell, and we're really delighted, Colin, that you're able to spend some time with us today and tell us all a little bit about that story.
Thanks, Tony. It has been interesting, and interesting enough, listening to what I've been listening to today, some of the cars that we call veteran and vintage, they were fairly new when I was doing my apprenticeship. They weren't old bombs, they were very nice motor cars. I think of Tarrants and Pages and all sorts of cars, Oaklands, and so the Nash was certainly one of them. But no, it has been, I did an apprenticeship back in the early 50s, and I worked for a fellow by the name of Jay Pascoe, who eventually built a drive-in theatre. Plus, then after selling that, they built Calder Park Raceway. It was only natural that I'd move along into a lot of motor racing. I worked on and off doing both commentary and motor racing. As Norm said, we went down to Riverside back in the 60s, had 2 cars I built there, one for, both for market gardeners out at Keeler actually, one for a fellow by the name of Bruno Battaglia. We won the Vic Champs with that, and the other one for Barry Milburn. The following year we won the Vic Champs with that one as well. Then drag racing took a little bit of a hiatus, and I got conned, as it were, to go and work for Larry Ormsby. Larry wanted me to work for him as a manager for one of his brake places. And the day I walked into the place, he said, "Do you know anything about drag racing?" The fellow next door, who would have been a good friend of Larry O'Toole's actually, because they live up in Castlemaine, was Jack Collins, and he was running Calder, and he said, he wants me to take my XRGT out there. I said, "Yeah, I know a little bit about drag racing." So I took the car for a drive. I might add, I went in on a Saturday morning to see how his workshop functioned, to start on the Monday and finished up working all Saturday afternoon. Took the car for a run. There's not much you can do in that little bit of time, but I did a few things to it, and end result is we took it out to Calder. We were runner-up on the day to a fellow by the name of Colin Hyams in a GT40, and so we didn't do too bad. And that started Larry's career in drag racing, and we progressed to an XWGT-HO, which became the most winning Ford sedan in Australia, which attracted the attention of the Ford Motor Company. They offered to help us in some small way with parts and pieces. And Alterna invited me up to the workshop to have a look at it, which was, you know, Lot 6. Now people hear of Lot 6, what's Lot 6? Well, it was a building, a nondescript building in 224 Marnie's Road in Campbellfield. And this wasn't in 1969 when I went there, but in 1969, when it opened up, they built the first GT-HO. In fact, last Sunday was the 50th anniversary, and we spent the whole day, big screen TV, 150 odd people, trying to commemorate what we did in those days. A few questions asked, a few myths shattered. Anyway, that's another story. So we built the car for Larry. It went very, very well, very successful. And eventually Alterna offered me a job, which I pondered over for some time, probably 12 seconds, and said, yes, work in a genuine racing team. That was pretty amazing, actually, to think that in those days, most of the cars that were racing were not sponsored by a factory. General Motors, Chrysler, Holden, Toyota, they didn't want to put their name on a failure, certainly on a success. GM did it a good way, they had a dealer, so if the car won, that's good for GM. If it loses, bad luck, the dealers didn't do a good job. Ford put their name on the line and decided to build race cars. Much, I guess, because of Alterna's insistence. Those cars were very, very successful. I continued working there until 1973. We went to the first 1,000 Bathurst, which was a brand new thing, and up till then obviously it was 500 miles. This was an extra 35 odd laps. So, and I at that stage had graduated to being the engine builder for those engines. So I had to build a motor that would last 1,000k under full throttle basically. And luckily enough we won the race. I might add we had two cars, the other one didn't go too far, but anyway, we got through. At the end of 73 or after that race, Ford pulled the pin, but they kept all of us on. They didn't know how to get rid of us. Like, we had done nothing wrong. So overnight we went from being motor mechanics to automotive engineers. I couldn't even spell it, but I became one. So for the next 12 months, the workshop kept going, doing all sorts of odd things, making different vehicles for overseas. And I was still building the engines for Alan Moffat's racing 1973 Australian Touring Car Championship, which he luckily won. You want to ask me some questions, Tony?
You're doing pretty well. It's the easiest interview I've ever done, Colin. But I suppose people would be really interested to know a bit more about what it was like to be a mechanic, an engine builder, a senior person in a big works team. What was a week like, say, leading up to a race like the Bathurst 1000?
Yeah, that sums it up in one go. Hectic. It was very long hours. People think, I wonder how much they got paid. Back in 1970s, average motor mechanic got $4,000 a year, $2 an hour, so $80 a week. So did we. That's exactly what we got paid. However, we got paid overtime, time and a half for the first 4 hours, double time for the next lot of hours. And our normal working week started at 8 o'clock in the morning and finished at a minute to midnight. Why a minute to midnight? If we didn't have an 8-hour break, we would have got double time the next day, and we didn't think that was fair either. So we would knock off at a minute to midnight, so we were getting paid 8 hours, and the next 4 hours at time and a half, the next 4 hours at double time. So we were doing all right. Let's put it this way, our wage would have bought us 2.5 GTHOs. So it was all right, no complaints. I went to work one Monday morning at 8 o'clock. I came home at 5 o'clock, which is early, on the Thursday, and not left the workshop in that length of time. That's the sort of hours we worked. We had this reunion last Sunday, as I was saying, and the wives were talking. They were race widows. They very rarely saw us. It was full go. That particular workshop had no apparent hierarchy. You couldn't walk in and say, oh, he's in charge of this or he's in charge of that. We worked together. It was a team, a full team effort. No one gave the orders. We just basically knew what we were doing. Yes, Alterna might say, look, there's something new we're going to try, and we would try it. He might try 7 things at once, which was a little bit of a problem, because if one of them didn't work, which one didn't? But so it was just long, hard hours, many, many hours.
I know there's no one answer to this, but when you are charged with the job of building an engine that's supposed to last for 1,000 kilometres at full throttle, what are the kind of things that you do to try and make that sort of engine as bulletproof as you can?
Few people know exactly what I'm talking about here, but blueprinting is what we call it. The thing is, back in the 70s, you had to run the parts that those engines had when they left the factory. Today's cars have what they call, Carrillo rods and all sorts of pistons and things like that. Whatever was in the car, that's what you had to run. So you had to work out a way to make it bulletproof. Now, obviously, altering the clearances of bearings, pistons and things like that will make less friction, less stresses, but there's not a lot you can do other than in blueprinting. It's a matter of measuring so that the crankshaft's in the centre of the block, decking the tops of the cylinder block to make sure it's right. We were able to not remove any metal from the cylinder heads. So if we wanted to balance the combustion chambers for compression ratio, couldn't do anything like that. You had to do it by other means, other than removing metal from the head. You could perhaps take some off the top of the valve, that was okay, that was allowed. But yeah, we heat treated the pistons. Was that legal or not? Well, if you put a piston, an aluminium piston, that is the one that comes from the factory, in an oven for 48 hours or so, when you pull out, it's a harder piston. It happened a while ago, so I guess I can tell you this. We were told that we had to pull the pistons out to be tested, and this was after a Sandown race. We brought the cars back and we were all tired. We convinced the scrutineers that if they taped the bonnet shut, taped the tyres to the ground, we would go home, not touch the cars. They could come back the next morning and see us pull it apart. And that's exactly what they allowed us to do. I then, at 6 o'clock the next morning, took 9 pistons down to Murray Carter, because Murray used to help us a lot because he had a dyno, we didn't. And I said, here's pistons, someone will come here and want to test these pistons. 8 are for you, let them have one to destroy. He said, okay, all right, that sounds good. So they came down to test his pistons, and they did what they call the Brunel test, which is basically hitting it with a centre punch, see how deep it goes in, to see how hard it is. And they said, Murray, your pistons are harder than the Ford ones. So it was not bending the rules, but reading the rules properly, knowing how to get the most out of what you've got. I mean, conrods are, a real problem, and you couldn't alter them. You just had to run with what you've got. Yeah.
Thanks. So you ended up working with Alan Moffat as a privateer until 1977. That was a very spectacularly successful year. Can you give us a bit of insight into what that was like?
Yeah, well, actually, what had happened is after Ford closed down in 1975, in January, I took up trade school teaching, which was absolutely fantastic because most of the students knew what I'd done. They were quite interested in anything I wanted to tell them. Plus, I could get them free tickets for Colin, so it was pretty popular. And Alan rang me and said, I'm running this campaign to try and win Bathurst. He brought out Carol Smith from America, who was a great organiser, and a procurer of people. Found out who could do what. He got Peter Malloy, who unfortunately passed away last week, to build the motors. He got me to come over there and do the diffs and gearboxes, and generally just help every night of the week. I was teaching, so I had the time. Teaching's not hard if you know how you do it. So we worked and got those cars. I didn't have to worry about the motors. On the day of Bathurst, a strange thing happened. Carol Smith collapsed big time on a Saturday night. Put him, back then, Alan had an International Harvester as his service truck. It had big ramps going into it. We put Carol Smith on the ramps, and he could have been dead. He was really bad. So I thought, oh, well, not much I can do here, so I'll just I'll take over. So every 2 hours I'd send 2 people to bed for 1 hour. That's it, 1 hour. Go home, have a shower, have a sleep, and get back to here straight away. And all we did, Peter Malloy did the motors, so he was just working on the motors. I just got every nut and bolt in that car, take it out, drilled, 16th inch hole, tie wire, so that nothing would fall off. The car was good, didn't want anything to fall off it. End result is they were 1 and 2. It shouldn't have been Bond at second. He had the better car. Alan ran out of brakes. What happened is Jackie Hicks was a good Formula 1 driver and believed if you raced up to a corner at warp speed and then stood on the brakes and then accelerated again, as in Formula 1, it would be good, but it unfortunately wore out the brakes really bad. So much so that the caliper pushed out through the brake pad and all the fluid drained out, so it had no front brakes at all for the last 5 laps, which was rather serious. We weren't going to change pads today everything's changed, they can change pads and things like that. But yeah, it was a good experience, as you said.
You also did some test driving for Ford. You weren't a race driver yourself, but you had a lot of laps, particularly at Calder. What was it like?
I actually did 540 laps of Calder, of which over 2 days, and of which the last hour was at whatever I could drive at, which happened to be exactly what the race drivers would lap at in a race, not just on their own. They probably would have been quicker on their own, but I could actually, the car was set up and I was doing 48s. This was on the short track at Calder. And as I said, I did 280 laps in one car and 260 in the other. That was in 1972. Because of my size, which I'm a little jockey as you can see, I was also the fueler. And when we got up to Bathurst, I picked up the first churn to put into, we had 3 cars, John French, Howard Marsden and Fred Gibson. I couldn't lift the churn up. And if anyone ever goes up to Bowden's and have a look at the cars, and you have a real good look above the fuel churn area, you might see a dent in the roof where I actually dropped it because my arms were just so sore after doing that many laps of Calder. But yeah, I've probably done more laps of Calder in a GDHO than most of the racing car drivers, to be honest with you.
And Colin, you seem almost to have been fated to have a life involved in motorsport. As you said, you started off as an apprentice working for Pasco's, who ended up running Calder. But even the fellow across the road, his name was Stan Jones. Can you just tell us a little bit about the early days there of Stan Jones at Maseratis and go-karts?
Okay, yes, it was interesting listening before about Diana Gaze, because the Davisons, who I know John very, very well, the Davisons used to come there quite often. Stan had a Maserati. Before that he had a home-built car which was done through Repco, the Maybach 1, 2 and 3. Then he got this Maserati, 250F, and eventually I got to know a lot of the motor racing personalities in the area. And when I left there after my apprenticeship was finished and a new person came in and he asked me to do something to a Holden motor of all things, it had a little bit of main bearing noise, and he said, just want you to take the bearings out and put some paper under the shells to reduce the clearance. And I said, you're serious? He said, yes. So I left. I couldn't handle it. I thought if I get into that habit, that'll be the habit for the rest of my life. And I went up and worked for Stan Jones. And it was in the era when go-karts were just starting. And he said, what do you know about go-karts? Nothing. So I did as much as I could, and then I decided I'd go to watch a go-kart meeting. I saw all these cars, what we call understeering. They would turn the steering and just go straight into hay bales, which were mostly run at all places of at drive-in theatres. I thought, there's got to be a better way than this. So I then went down to the Speedway and I watched the motorbikes and sidecars, looked at the suspension setups, and thought, yep, I can make this a little bit better. So I built my own front end, and I got young Alan in the car, and one Saturday afternoon we're up in the workshop at Stan Jones Motors, and we wet the whole concrete floor, got Alan to just steer the car around, so we're just seeing if the wheels were scrubbing. It's a pretty rough way of doing it, but you know, you can see it on water. And one of the tie rod ends, turning the wheels, dropped out because it only had a bolt in it, it wasn't bolted up, and it dropped out. But the weird thing was, when he turned the left wheel turned because it was hooked up, so did the right wheel. And when he turned the left to the right wheel followed it. So I thought, I must have this fairly right because of the angle of the kingpin. Obviously the weight transfer was enough to make it swing around, and it looked unbelievable. We could actually just drop the bolt back in the hole. Alan, of course, as we know, went on to become world champion, and just recently at a talking of Larry Ormsby, he was inducted into the CAMS Hall of Fame, and Alan was down there, and we reintroduced ourselves again.
Thank you very much. We've got some time for questions, and I think there's probably a few questions for Colin. Does anyone want to start the process? Darryl, then Jeff. Yes, Darryl.
Colin, Australians pretty much in every venture they take on seem to punch above our weight with respect to the rest of the world, and that certainly applies to the number of Australians who found themselves as chief engineers, head mechanics, team bosses throughout the motor racing world. What do you attribute that to?
Lack of spare parts, really. You couldn't get them. You know, we had we built a rallycross car up at Ford's, which had a FVA engine in it, which was a little 1800 or 1600, sorry, what they call a 4-valve assembly Ford engine. That was a Formula One engine, and I had the head off it, and I did some work on it. And one of the English mechanics came over here for a rally we're doing. He said, "I've never seen one of them apart." I said, "But you work at Dagenham." He said, "Yeah." He said, "But we sent them back to where they built them." So we didn't have the parts. And you go back into the 50s, you know, you get these early people like Eddie Thomas and those sort of people, they just made the bits. And we were stuck with that, yeah, you just had to figure it out yourself, yeah. Hey, you make mistakes while you're doing it though. Yeah.
What horsepower did you get out of Larry Ormsby's engines in the end?
If you're talking about the V8s, the Windsor motor were flat out getting about 325 to 370. With the Cleveland motors, I didn't actually ever do a Cleveland motor for Larry, but the Cleveland motors that we won Bathurst with, they were getting, people think, you know, I'm mad saying that it's such a low number, but 405 to 408 horsepower. Today, you know, that's just ridiculous. 600 horsepower is what the supercars have got.
Yeah.
And you know, I built 2 engines, one for the Moffat car and one for the Bond car, or 2 that we were going to use, plus one for what we call the test car, and they all had just on the fat side of 400. So not a huge amount of horsepower, but enough for the day. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, Mark.
Well, maybe it was fantastic discussion to cover so much ground. The thing that occurs to me a little bit is just what you thought about how you rated the various drivers, you know, French, Gibson, Moffat, you mentioned Jackie X, Alan, Colin, all those. What did you?
Right, it's very difficult to answer that completely, but Pete Deegan would outdrive any problem. Useless as a test driver because he was so good. Alan Moffat knew the moment you did something to the car, whether it was right or not, he said, "You've made a change." He might come in and say, "That's perfect." You'd give him a stopwatch and say, "You're 0.5 of a second slower." "So you're telling me it's easier to drive?" "Yes." "Put it back the other way." Put it back and he'd be back on time. Fred Gibson would come in and say, "Go down 2 notches on bump and half a turn off rebound on the shocks." And one day we decided not to do it. He did 1 lap and come back and said, "Okay, finish messing around, guys." So yeah, X and those sort of people, didn't get to know them. They sort of arrived on the day and drove. But yeah, different drivers have different inputs, and it's very important to be able to read their input back to you, as you would know from, you know, from Jack and those sort of people. Yeah, yeah.
There's a story that the 1969 Ford team cars were really very, very good, but they were using imported Goodyear rubber that Alan Moffat tested and found to be very durable. But in the race with other drivers driving those cars, they weren't as durable. Do you have anything to say about those sorts of different approaches?
in the 69 race, they brought Alan in. I wasn't there in 69, but I do know this story. They brought him in several laps, several being, I don't know how many, could be 10 or 15, before the end to change his tyres, and they were perfect. They'd have done the race. He was leading by so far, it wasn't funny. The Detroit locker is either in or out. That is, you've got drive to both back wheels or you've got drive to one wheel, depending on where your throttle is. And the drivers didn't quite know how to handle it. So they were driving it and throwing it into the corners too hard. Like I said, the laps that I was doing at Calder probably wouldn't have got me through a race. I probably would have also worn out the tyres. But Moffat had that feel of the tyres. I did a lap with Moffat at Sandown, and I thought, well, I better go back one step. I did a lap first with Fred Gibson, and he took me down the back straight, and he said, this is understeer. He just turned the car down at Dandenong Corner. I thought, well, there's Dandenong Road, and I'm going to be in it in about 1 second from now. And he hit the throttle, he said, that's power oversteer. I said, okay, thanks. Came back, and Moffat said, well, I know what he thought, but he thought, I'm not going to let this happen. He said, get in this one, Colin. So I get in, he took me around, and I thought, oh, how boring is this? Click, click, touch, touch. You know, just so smooth. Came back in, and the guys were running over. You're under the lap record, you're under the lap record. I couldn't believe the difference. One felt fast, the other didn't. One was fast. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Were you involved in Super Falcons?
Yes, I was. Only the day I started, the first job I got was to actually work on the Super Falcon, but they just wanted me to do some welding across the, of all my skills, welding happened to be the worst, but anyway, they got me to weld. Yeah, in Pete Gagan's car, they got me to weld the crossbar to hold the towers together, yes. And you know, as Al Turner would say in his American drawl, this better not look like chicken shit.
What went wrong?
What went wrong is they tried too many things at once. If you ever went out testing, the changes that Al would do were unbelievable. Mick Lambert sorted out Fatty's car up in Sydney. It was a good car. The engines dynoed well over at Repco Brabham. It was a good system, that Lucas fuel injection. They just tried too much too quickly. Yeah. But it put out lots of horsepower.
We're probably going to have to call it quits there.
We will, thank you. Thanks very much, Colin.